Welcome to our webinar on what CROs get wrong about medical device trials. My name is Mary Beckwith, co-founder, co-CEO here at Lindus Health. We wanted to host this webinar, firstly, as a CRO ourselves. We're fairly active in medical device trials. We've seen just a lot of examples of how these differ from more traditional drug trials and how often CROs can get these wrong. So yeah, we're very lucky to have about 500 signups for today, so it should be a lively discussion. Cool. So we'll go ahead and introduce my awesome expert panelists for this. And I'm hearing reports that they may be long lost cousins or relatives, both residing in Austin, Texas, I believe. We'll find out more about that in a second. But firstly, over to you, Paul, to say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul. My background is coming up to the technical ranks through operations, doing a lot of clinical and regulatory type work as well, although never quite running those departments. Career has been, with one exception, in the active implantable device space for 25 years. That one exception being, you may have seen these little plastic wearable disposable sensors on the back of the arm for glucose sensing. So I worked on early generation of that. And other applications have been in cardiovascular, particular heart failure, hypertension, implantable devices for those, as well as for acid reflux and gastric neurostimulation. And then more recently, coming back to be the CEO here at Glucotrack, CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, is a very, very wonderful technology. So many people, and it works quite super well, but there are still some challenges with that. And if you look at those challenges, one form or another, there's about a half a dozen of those, and has to do with the fact that the device is wearable. And so we decided that we would try to address this wearable plastic disposable piece by just going in the body and address all those half dozen issues all at once. So that's what we're doing, and very excited to be here. And between Julie and myself, we realized that couldn't find the common family tree, as Mary said, but we hope for other reasons beside our surnames that at the end of this webinar, you'll think that, wow, that was just too good.
Thank you, Paul. Julie, over to you as well.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Julie Good. Like Paul, probably a similar time in this industry. I've been in medical device, clinical research, and regulatory for 25 years. So first 23 years of that was at Medtronic, worked in neuromodulation and also in cardiac rhythm management. So saw a lot of different active implantables. Then 2 years ago, I made the jump to a startup, Motif Neurotech. It's in this emerging and really exciting brain-computer interface space. And so I've had a variety of experiences using in really small ways and now in larger ways, not having a team like the size of Medtronic's clinical research teams. But so yeah, excited to share experiences and getting to know Paul, that we live in the same city and never knew each other.
Yeah, and so the rumor that you were somehow related is too good to be true. But you are both not related, but you are both very much experts in this field, which is why we're lucky to have you both here. And I think what's also super interesting, and we'll get into this a bit further on, is both of your careers span leadership roles in everything from small, innovative medical device startups to larger players like Medtronic and Dexcom. And I think something we see a lot is the different approaches taken by smaller companies versus larger companies in this space. So yeah, excited to get into that in a moment. But first, we have a couple of polls to roll out to our audience. So I'm just going to launch the first one here, if you'll give me a second. So yeah, wanted to get the audience's temperature on this question. When conducting medical device research, how much of the study execution do you usually delegate to a CRO or external partner versus handling it internally? And I think this is interesting because there's definitely a trend in pharma scale drug research to handle a lot of things internally increasingly, but that may be reversing. Thank you guys for filling this out. I can see responses are flooding in already, which is pretty interesting. I'll go ahead and give everyone a couple more seconds to answer that. Okay, there we go. Thanks for everyone's participation. So looks like we've got a pretty good spread. I'm going to end the poll now and share results. So yeah, I mean, it looks like most people are somewhere on the kind of in the middle of the spectrum of, all or most activities or a few select tasks. And then there's a few folks who keep it all in-house. So when we were, as a panel, kind of discussing this topic before launching the webinar, we touched on a few things that are issues that often come up And I think it sort of has centers on this kind of pharmaceutical drug first mindset that CROs and really the whole industry has. And we've sort of elucidated that a bit here. We see kind of delayed timelines or timelines that are really set up for a large pharma company developing a drug and not really right-sized to the needs of a smaller device company. There's definitely like a language barrier, let's say, where language in documentation, proposals is clearly geared towards a pharmaceutical drug study and not a device study. Maybe, Julie, Paul, curious on your feedback on this. One, this language barrier point. Have you seen this? And does it matter that a CRO refers to a protocol and not a clinical investigation plan? Curious for your views on this.
I can share my recent experience with this when I was collecting bids from a number of CROs and seeing terms that I wasn't familiar with. So like Paul, I've never worked in pharma. So my entire career is in medical device. And certainly having been at one company for a long time, you get used to the words, how you describe things or what you call certain documents or activities. So my first reaction to seeing some things that I hadn't seen before was, oh, I'm used to seeing some different words because of the company that I worked at, and realizing that these are more pharma terms. And, as a recipient of a bid that's about to embark on a very expensive device trial, being concerned, do they know, are we speaking the same language? And how is this going to translate going forward if we are from the get-go not using the terminology that's used in the medical device space?
Yeah, and I agree with Julie. And adding to that, if the CRO is not using the right terminology with you, and in particular, again, you're using a CRO for their expertise. And what is the first step? It's engaging with the agency and developing pre-subs and protocols and that sort of a thing. So if you go to the agency with incorrect terminology, number one, that puts you under a little bit more of a magnifying glass, because the agency does know the right terminology. And so then they're like, oh gosh, maybe this team doesn't know what they're doing. And so it doesn't put your best foot forward with the agency. So that's something we all respect the agency. They do a great job for us and they're keeping us safe. And we need to make their lives easier as well. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to think this was just about like kind of shibboleths and in-group signaling, but when you're sort of talking to the agency, it will have a big impact on how seriously they're likely to take your file, right? Which is critical. I'm very curious to hear from you both. Have you had examples of this drug or pharma first mindset being incorrectly applied to device trials and maybe problems it caused or can cause?
Yeah, so I'll just continue on that example that I was sharing. And I think one of the things that as we translate those words, trying to figure out, oh, it probably means the same thing, or we're kind of talking about the spirit of the same thing. I think we can be flexible in that, and it probably doesn't matter. And that can be true. But I think some of the problems Paul was communicating, especially when you're talking to sites and you're using terminology or they're having to share terminology with their IRB, for example, with how we're tracking our devices, and we're not using the right terms. Those are getting reviewed, as Paul mentioned, about credibility, but also site confusion and what forms are we collecting. You might use a 1572 as, we're using this form, but we're not. This is not the same kind of trial.
And again, just following on that is in a similar fashion with the agency. And when you go in to the agency, as Julie mentioned with IRBs, they tend to be a little bit quicker turnaround than the agency is. And if you go in, you submit, there's a clock, there's a timeline. And so if you go in with an incorrect submission, because they know the terminology and they have different sets of review procedures than within CDRH than in the other division of the FDA. So then you're essentially setting yourself up for, you just wasted 90 days in an IDE review, for example, and you're gonna have to go through that again. So that costs time and money.
Mary, if I could just add on one more thing before you move on that I thought about, and it's around logistics and communication, because it may not be a terminology question, but when you're talking about a device that may have software or a patient that has to use something in a different setting or something that a patient has to use, so you have usability considerations and things that you're trying to learn, a device sponsor is going to be very actively involved in that process because there's an opportunity to make changes and you need to be really close to that device usage in a way that is, so the communication that comes with that and how involved a medical device sponsor is going to be much greater than in a drug study. So that communication then turns into something that needs to be managed because it can feel more complex, but they're going to be extremely involved in the day-to-day conduct.
Yeah, that's a good point. And interestingly, something else that we find ourselves getting pulled into a lot is the notion of a controlled trial in a device setting is often quite different from a drug setting where there are pretty established frameworks for what constitutes a placebo in the drug world. But in the device context, for digital interventions, the concept of a sham app is often used by the FDA, but there's not much of a standardized framework for what constitutes an appropriate sham app. You see a lot of studies historically with high control group response rates because the sham app is too good. On physical devices, again, it can be really tough to interpret the FDA's feedback and come up with something that's appropriate. More examples that come to my mind.
I think it's a great example, Mary. And, having lived through something very similar, and another aspect of devices that a lot of particular CROs don't understand is when the FDA had you do a sham study, there's the actual procedure effect as well. So in a lot of these cases, the implantable device in particular, when you're wearing a device or there's that procedural aspect. And Julie alluded to it earlier on the usability side. And so when a CRO is tracking usability factors, but they need to understand that a device can fail. How do you track that? What is the mechanism? In the quality system post-approval, there's a method, but within clinical trial, how do you set that up? And if you don't have experience how to set that up, you can set yourself up for looking like you have a ton of AEs when maybe they're not AEs because they're device software bug, for example. And then again, on the sham portion of it, Mary, is because the procedure has such an impact on a patient's mindset, if not also the condition, that goes to the heart of protocol design. And how do you tease that out up front with the agency? Because, the agency is wonderful, but sometimes they don't have the therapies as well as we do. And also the landscape, maybe necessarily, in some cases, not all. So it's a heavy dialogue there. And an experienced CRO with devices needs to understand that.
Yeah, we know from experience just how common the kind of sham response effect can be and how important it can be to design a genuine appropriate control. It's not easy, but the whole success of the study hinges on it, or the program. And I think we had a couple of questions from anonymous attendee. So I think the first one was about AEs, which I think we've already answered, but adverse events, device equivalent of a placebo. Anon is referring to a sham concept of a sham control, essentially a device that doesn't contain, I think the FDA defines it as a device that doesn't contain that you think your device contains. So when we talk about sham apps in the digital health context, let's say you have a CBT digital therapeutic app and the mechanism of action is the cognitive behavioral therapy. Your sham app would be a kind of shell app that doesn't contain any aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the FDA, looks at that and uses, tries to use that as an appropriate control. But of course, what we see a lot is, as you say, Paul, just like putting someone in a trial, randomizing them onto an arm, giving them, that sort of care and check-in, and then also giving them a sham app. It does cause them to maybe change their behavior or just interact with their condition in a different way to just having them be in the community. And hence we see that those control groups kind of responding to the treatment, even though the treatment isn't being delivered.
I'll just say one more thing about this, Mary. This part can be incredibly complex in the way the trial is executed because there are a lot of ways of blinding when we've got a sham control. And you mentioned the effects that a sham procedure can have on outcomes. The complexity in delivering and blinding can get really complex as well. You may be doing something different with your device. You may have multiple roles because you've got somebody that has to interact with a device that isn't going to be the person that does any sort of collecting any outcome measures. So you can have a lot more players involved on the site side and the sponsor side and more on the CRO too, just in order to pull off a successful blinding. There could be some things learned about the device that have to be changed in order to deliver an adequate sham. And those things would need to be negotiated with FDA so that you can prove that you're delivering.
And Julie, I'm super curious for your experience here. How lenient have you found the FDA in the past when it comes to these important details around exactly how the sham control is to be treated?
This is interesting because I think that there's a history of saying it's a device you can't blind. And so I think the bar for healthcare in general is higher. We can't just say we just can't. Getting more novel in the way a sham is delivered is important. That doesn't necessarily mean sham surgery or something. I think there's a history on saying something's unethical. It is equally unethical to deliver therapies to patients that don't work because they weren't studied well. So I think the bar is high. And I think that as part of the negotiation of, what can we do to ensure that the effects are truly the therapy and not the experience, the procedures, all the things that can happen when you just have a high touch patient experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes
And
sense. Because this is something we see, like we spend a ton of time working with our clients on. And I think it's something that people often either underestimate or kind of get wrong.
so, yeah, I've been through multiple sham controlled trials, active implantable sham controlled trials. And, one of the blessings and the curse of an active implantable is that you can easily do a sham, right? Because, you implant everybody, half are on, half are off. It's in that part, it's fairly straightforward. But the tough part is for non-active implantable devices, they can't do a sham. So they're always going to be a single arm study. They're comparing this optimal medical treatment against themselves. So that's a very big challenge. And when you negotiate these things with the FDA, a lot of times, because you have a novel technology, you don't know what the sham effect might be. And neither does the FDA. And so you negotiate in good faith with the FDA and they in good faith with you. It's bidirectional.
Yeah.
These trials take a long time. And sometimes by the time you get to the point of submitting your PMA, the people that you've negotiated with at the agency are gone. And you have somebody else picking up the application and they don't have the same mindset and they don't necessarily agree with their predecessors. And that really complicates things. You can't underscore the importance of this effort.
And with, let's say, disruption to the FDA ongoing, and it seems particularly concentrated in the medical device side, how do you deal with that when your reviewer changes partway through a project? Any lessons from your experience?
So your question about when that's revealed over time?
When your reviewer changes and maybe they disagree with something the previous reviewer, you and the previous
Oh,
reviewer
okay.
agree, any kind of tips for maybe some listeners who are in that situation now, given we know that it's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where there are minutes to all these meetings, the history of what's been agreed to, and in certain types of meetings are not always binding. I think that having that documented history of the conversations that have been held so far, that puts the burden on the industry sponsor to ensure or expect that reviewers can change. And how do I make sure in every conversation and interaction that we are doing so in a way that ensures, even if it's not commitment, that we are anticipating that something could change down the road, especially if you're in a long trial.
And typically, whether it's a lead reviewer or a biostatistician or what have you, the documentation is key. And also, as soon as possible, try to get immediate alignment. Say, oh, you're new. Let's walk through. Let's give some history. And you'll suss out whether there's going to be a challenge or not. And at least that'll, if anything, it gives you a heads up on what you need to do moving forward.
Those are really good points. And thank you both for sharing. I'd be willing to bet that some of the folks in the audience find themselves in that situation now, which can be tricky. I think we have a couple of questions coming in. Firstly, just a comment on diagnostic devices from Lisbeth, which is interesting. And I appreciate that diagnostic trials can often sort of technically come under the purview of medical device trials, depending on the mode of diagnosis. But yeah, agree that a traditional RCT can often not really be the right approach for a diagnostic device. So we have another question here from anonymous attendee for you, Julie, about, how did you manage a sham or a sham control with Motif, given implantation and sensation, if you're able to discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true across neuromodulation. And so what I can say, and this is, again, true in the experience that I had at Medtronic as well, learning what things feel like, and that may mean characterizing in multiple trials. So thinking about the cadence of trials that you are going to have and how and when you're going to learn that information and build that into your clinical strategy of what's known and how can I learn that early and apply it to future trials. And certainly you can also look to what is happening across your industry. What is the data telling you from other perhaps investigator-sponsored studies that are going on with similar types of devices? And so leveraging what else is known out there in similar trials, similar technologies, similar diseases that you're treating, because this is not new in neuromodulation. So the way we're thinking about it is, how do you spread out your strategy to incrementally learn something or leave space in a trial to build that into your strategy that you can incorporate what you've learned early?
To give another pinpoint example on some particular device, like we dealt with a trial where I mentioned earlier about surgical procedures being able to impact the blinding. We were seeing it was an implantable device. The surgical techniques were changing. The standard surgical techniques in that region were changing, not just with regard to our device. We saw that that was going to affect our clinical trial. So we raised that with the FDA. Like, hey, look, surgeons might be doing this while they're there because they see something and they want to fix it. And so the FDA, the solution, put it in your statistical analysis plan, address the ability to analyze it, with or without, you look at it. I'm going to get way ahead of my skis on biostatistics, but there's ways you can look at whether it's impactful or not on a statistical standpoint. So make sure you get that into your SAP.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, there's an interesting question from Jennifer. She asks, our CRO says that they have to analyze the data for a huge cost. However, we have a team of data scientists internally that can do it much better and more cheaply. Is our CRO correct? Does an independent third party always need to analyze the study data, presumably for a regulatory submission trial?
No, it's not a requirement.
Yeah, I was going to say that's definitely, I'm not aware of it being any kind of requirement that an independent third party. I mean, it is important that the organization that analyzed the data, are blinded, presumably. It is a form of kind of single or double blinded study. So you want to maintain that blinding. Like, you can't, for instance, have the site investigator or something who is seeing participants analyzing the data, but there's nothing to my knowledge in any of the regs that says that it has to be an independent third party. I don't think any trial activity, strictly speaking, needs to be delegated to a third party as long as you respect blinding. Traditionally monitoring, that's the big one, because there is seen to be extra value to having an independent third party conduct something like monitoring, but I don't think needs to be delegated, but often sponsors do. So without knowing all the full details, it sounds like your CRO may not be correct on that one, Jennifer. I'll just round out our poll answers. So, I can share results. So a pretty broad spread of answers, but the one that sticks out to me here is the patient recruitment and retention. And arguably, if you fold study timelines in with that as well, and even site recruitment and site management, they're all kind of sides of the same coin. This is super common. We see a lot of folks struggle with patient recruitment and retention. In my view, they're almost always like, finding patients isn't the issue. The issue is CROs are not creative enough about how they structure the kind of patient journey. They don't pay enough attention to human factors, basically. And they're also not creative enough with site selection. So examples of tactics that we've leveraged is stepping back and thinking like, okay, is maybe a hybrid or partially decentralized design, will that remove burden from patients without compromising data validity, and then help us get retention higher? Because nothing causes patients to drop out, like a load of inconvenient visits. Maybe they need to take time off work, et cetera. Or why are we just relying on overworked sites and investigators to do patient recruitment? Let's use a central enrollment campaign that we can be in control of to try and enroll patients faster. Very interesting point there, and something that we think a lot about. I don't know, Paul or Julie, if you guys have any reflections on, does that match your own experience of things that have kind of CROs have got wrong, or things that have gone wrong in the studies that you've experienced? Would be curious to hear.
It's definitely not surprising. I think this is universal. And as somebody has been very actively involved in site selection, there's a match of who wants to be involved in your trial. And there's always excitement at the beginning. It's like interviewing for a job, and we think we can do this. We're going to enroll this many patients. And it's maybe at best half of what that number is. There are so many things that contribute to patient recruitment. With active implantals, retention is a lot easier, but the recruitment part actually is harder because the commitment is different. If we're talking about a surgery or something like that, I would be incredibly hands-on as a sponsor of knowing and engaging with the site, because these are also your future customers. I would not ever leave this solely for the CRO to figure out. This is a partnership. You work together to figure out what is it going to engage the site, and your CRO should be able to help with the tools. Like, if we went different ad campaigns, or how do we reach patients, and where do those patients live? If they're not going to come from that practice, if they're going to come from a different pathway, they're fantastic tools to get those patients identified and to the right sites. And the CRO should be able to do that.
And I want to amplify Julie's response, because she's spot on. It's a different set of commitment by the patient, other than showing up whatever follow-ups to assess the therapy, whether it's a drug therapy or a device therapy. There's that. That's the same burden on everybody. But when you're looking at the upfront commitment, you're either taking a pill on one side, or you're wearing a device, or you're having a surgery to have an implanted device, or you're having a procedure to like an ablation procedure. So those are big commitments for patients. And so it takes a different recruitment skill. This is the big difference between pharma-specific CROs versus those who have device experience.
Yeah. And I'll pick up on that because we've got a couple of more broad-ranging questions from Jude and Robert, but I might try and answer those slightly later because they talk to some of the other things we'll cover in the webinar. But then Anon says, yeah, I haven't heard mention in terms of patient recruitment enrollment, the importance of appropriate IE criteria, so inclusion exclusion criteria, and getting physician involvement to understand the prevalence and realistic enrollment timelines, or the fear of some investigational procedures. On the IE criteria point, these can often be, particularly for implantables, very nuanced. Something we see is there's a lot of inter-investigator variability often as to what makes someone eligible for one of these studies. And so we see part of our role is like, how can we creatively reduce that variability by either selecting fewer higher enrolling investigators or higher quality investigators, or finding ways of decoupling enrollment from that site component so we can get by with more patients at fewer sites. But yeah, and then the asker points out patient recruitment and educational materials are incredibly important with invasive procedures and permanent implants. One more thing I'll say on this personally, then Paul, will turn it to you, is, I've been a participant in a few trials, one recently involving a CGM, and that's basically non-invasive, right? But I don't know if anyone here has used a CGM. I suspect, Paul, you certainly have, but given your business, but it was just an Abbott Freestyle Libre, but the applicator has a really scary looking needle in it. And without knowing, I thought that the needle was what remained in my arm, not the little filament in your interstitial fluid. And that really freaked me out. And it definitely affected how long I stayed in the study, because I thought, oh, I've got this needle sticking in my arm. And if I had an investigator there to kind of say, oh no, look, it's just the filament, that would have made a big difference. So it's those kind of patient soft factors can be really important, and just ensuring that the sites understand that. But anyway, Paul or Julie, I'll let you guys comment on that question just about the IA criteria, investigators kind of understanding of the IA criteria, and then educational materials for patients.
I will just say this about your enrollment eligibility, because I think while there's a ton of science, there's a little art to it as well. And there's a lot of stakeholders that need to give you input. We think about safety and having this really pure study population that we want to look at, and we want to make sure things stay really clean. But making sure that you've got physician input, your advisor should be telling you something about these patients. Like, hey, if you put that in there, you've just wiped out half of my patients. That takes them off the table. They're no longer eligible. In addition to talking to real patients, there's a big push for having patients or your target population involved in medical device design. They can also help you with your clinical study design and having them think about what does this criteria mean to them? Because there are some things that are sometimes more subjective, but also having them look at your educational materials. How are you going to recruit them? Make sure you have your target study populations or representatives from that population say what they think about them. Hey, that means nothing to me. That is the biggest turnoff. Now I really don't want to do your trial. Like, you want to know that, and having that input is really, really precious.
I'll answer a little bit on the recruitment side, because I think Julie nailed it on the IE side. Is on the recruitment side, and I think Mary alluded to this, it's very critical in his experience, whether it's the doc or the clinical coordinator, whoever is doing the informed consent with the patients on walking them through the potential risks. Yeah, it's on us as sponsors to really know who those folks are and how they do that. Because like in Mary's case, obviously, whoever was dealing with him totally blew it, right? No offense to that person, but so let's say, for example, back to a previous life I had where a device was implanted using laparoscopic surgery, very similar to a non-device therapy, a surgical approach to treat the same condition. And typical laparoscopy is done all the time throughout the world, every day. And of course, that does not go without risk. But when you have to give them the potential risks, and you really, how's that delivered? It's very critical. It can scare a patient or it can calm a patient. That's something else to consider.
And actually, yeah, I also wanted to ask you both. You both had fascinating careers spanning both large device companies like Medtronic and Dexcom to the more innovative startups that you both lead today. What are some of the differences you've observed around how large versus small device companies approach clinical trials? And I guess, are there things that each size could learn from each other?
I would say one of the things that you get with a large company is that the success of the company is not hinging on one clinical trial and one device. So it's one of our portfolio of lots of things that keep the money coming and things flowing. And so the timeline doesn't, of course, it matters less. But I would say compared to a startup with a single device and a single trial, every month delay is massive in terms of burn, commitments being made to investors. Your ability to raise is significantly more important.
You hit all the right points, Julie. It just cannot be more night and day because the big companies can budget these things well in advance and they're getting a huge allotment of cash to do this thing. And you know what you're working with, and you're not living under the pressure of, okay, I got 6 months of runway and I got a raise on this. It is just a completely different. So the urgency and how fast you have to move fast, and you can't take maybe as you always put patient safety first, but sometimes you'll take some business risks that a large company would not do.
Yeah, and on that, it's super ironic to me that the small companies who are living or dying by that readout, they're the ones who often have more budget constraints. And the big companies typically are throwing kind of everything at the wall. So I guess the worthy challenge, the rightful challenge of the CRO should be how to execute the study given those budget constraints in a way that minimizes risk and maximizes the chance of that positive readout, which is frankly just doable, right? Like there are lots of ways you can get creative, and we've touched on some of them in this call.
To your point, Mary, a lot of times and I'm sure Julie's seen this as well, what you see from CROs, you go to them, okay, we got the study design, and they come back to you with, okay, here's the budget. They don't do what you just said, which is, let's work with you. What do you have to work with? Let's be collaborative up front. Let's carve this up so we can get a maximum benefit together. Where can we help you? Where can you leverage a different resource if you need to fit within your budget constraints? And that's something that a lot of the big box CROs don't quite understand.
What stops them from being more creative in the way you describe?
Probably because, and I'm going to be speculative here because I'm not an expert in that particular industry, but definitely share Julie's thoughts as well. I just think that probably the largest part of their clientele and their revenue is from the larger companies who can afford to write the big checks. And of course, everything is a little more methodical. And as we talked about earlier, but Julie, I don't know what you guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, like you, Paul, I'm speculating, but I can say for a couple that declined altogether, like not interested in even a bid. And I think it's because being too small. If we look at the numbers on the cost on the left, that feels like probably pennies of the levers that I'm trying to pull aren't worth it.
I tend to agree with that. I mean, if you're a big CRO, 80% of your revenue comes from your top 3 or 4 accounts, which are probably big company accounts. It's very processized, and it's like the Spider-Man meme of the 2 Spider-Men pointing at each other. It's just process on one side, process on the other side. There's no room for creativity.
And may it also be the return business in drug trial, you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So you have all these phase 2A, phase 2B, you get all these different phases of trials, whereas device trials is typically like a feasibility and a pivotal, and you're done.
And I'm just looking through the Q&A quickly. Sammy, you had a statement, which I think we've touched on about these soft factors at the site, but also recognizing that a lot of sites themselves aren't often kind of dyed-in-the-wool device, have a device focus, and those errors can creep into. I'm curious, for kind of building on that question about the big versus small companies and price and business model, do you guys feel that have an appropriate pricing model now that you're both, running smaller companies? Is it something that worries you, or you wish they could do better?
Short answer, no. I had a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, who had a very similar experience to Julie recently. Went out to 4 CROs, and only one of them was within the ballpark and competitive. I mean, it's just the pricing models, and that's just the way it is.
We've discussed a lot of the issues, things that can go wrong. What can a CRO do to really stand out, to convince you that they're the right partner for entrusting the success or failure of your company? What can CROs do to make sure that they really stand out?
I think the biggest thing is demonstrating that they understand what levers and come to the table with levers. Like, hey, based on where you are and the type of trial that you need, you could probably do this. And even give you feedback on your protocol. Like, hey, you have a lot of stuff in here. Is this, how do you lean out your protocol as well? Like there's a lot of nice to haves and have to haves. Science can make us really, have some FOMO about, I got this one trial, I got one shot to get everything that I want to serve all of the things. I need approval, I need reimbursement, I need adoption because I got to be able to commercialize on this. Thinking about what you can do now or what you have to do now to get maybe a couple of those pieces and what you can do later, and having a true partner that is looking at those levers with you to help you lean out where you can, but that it's appropriate to where you are. If you're in an early study, it doesn't need the rigor of a pivotal trial. And having them come to the table with those ideas rather than just saying, this is what you have to have, because you don't know where to challenge.
I agree with Julie. And then sort of also a different perspective is I would like for, a CRO to have a device specific team. Don't pull people from your biopharma or whatever. We're a device and we want device expertise. So build a small team. You're big enough, you got enough money, whether you're CRO number 1, 2, or 3, and create a subgroup that specializes on devices, knows what those needs are. And then dovetailing on our previous moments ago conversation, Mary, is come to the table up front. How can we work together? We understand you're small. How can we work together? What's your budget? Let's figure it out. Be flexible. With the pharma, the pill is the pill. You're not changing the pill during the trial. Devices, you can't. So be flexible. Make sure simple things like your EDC can catch up with those, the need for that flexibility. How do you track a device failure and how do you record that? So, that's the thing that just so much seems to be missing.
Yeah, the devil's in the details with clinical research. We've got 7 more minutes in the webinar, tons of amazing questions, which is awesome. Please keep them coming. I'm just going to quickly go through and we'll try and get as many of these as we can. Robert has a question about, do drug-first CROs understand device-specific clinical strategies, sample sizes, predicate devices? We've touched on a few of these. The predicate devices aspect, I don't think we've really touched on yet. Aspects of the device that must be tested to demonstrate that your device looks like the predicate. Unusual FDA requirements, such as the FDA requiring glucose monitor technology to be compared to older technology, such as YSI. I don't know if that's something you can comment specifically on.
I'll jump in on maybe just 2 of them. So the YSI is, of course, it's an old product that's a medical device standard for measuring blood glucose values as a reference, as a lab reference that is used in trials all the time. How do you deal with having to change that if that company is not supporting it anymore? And that's tough. And there are there is an alternative out there that the FDA went to another company in advance to try to address this and then adopted their technology, a company, Nova Biomedical, and cleared them for a similar use. So there's a backup. As far as like the predicate devices question, which is very good in the 510K world, I've seen some CROs. This is also, this is more of a regulatory as opposed to a clinical specialty on the CRO. And it is hard to find the right regulatory CRO support who are willing to push the agency. They know that they're going to the agency many times, many different clients, so they don't want to blow up their reputation. And so they are going to be 9 out of 10 of them are going to be very conservative. And so that's tough. And so you have to push CRO and arm them with the right information and then make sure that they follow up. But get their temperature very early. Don't waste your time with the conservative ones.
Jude has a question about sham-controlled trial designs, in the medical device world. How can we approach sham trials in a way that maintains scientific accuracy without compromising patient trust or recruitment feasibility? I think we've touched on some of this already.
I think you need to think about it in terms of your whole strategy of learning, identifying what does your therapy feel like, especially for neuromodulator patients. So knowing what your therapy feels like, and those are the things that you need to achieve through your sham. In terms of scientific accuracy, I do think you need to be extremely careful and making sure you don't have unintended shifts in your outcomes. You make the point about patient trust or recruitment feasibility. It does make it hard. There's no doubt about that. A patient that knows that they're going to have a sham, but maybe knowing that it's not forever or just delayed, that can be palatable. But if it's a long controlled period, that is definitely going to impact your recruitment.
Weaver has a question, which is very specifically about neuromodulation bioelectronic wearable device in a mental health RCT, essentially how to create an appropriate sham for a kind of wearable neuromodulation device. I don't know if that's something you can comment on, Julie. It is something that we've done before, or we've done a couple of trials in this space. So happy to connect afterwards, Weaver, and share what we've seen work. But Julie, I'm picking on you in particular, just given the Motif's focus.
Yes. So probably not different than what I might have already said. Let's say I'm reading it more carefully. It sounds like the approach certainly makes sense, creates a discernible sensation. Okay, so we've been thinking about instruction. So I'm assuming this means what you tell the study participant of what they're going to expect is another strategy of acting. That is a huge part of, I guess, no better way of saying we're going to mislead. Like, this is what it feels like, and this is what it means, and everybody has this, which may or may not be true, just to make sure that they're not over interpreting what sensations may mean. I'll say one more thing about this. Patients have become extremely savvy with all the social media tools of finding each other through Reddit. They might come together and compare notes. This is not new. I've seen studies that had blogs from many years ago, and you can include that in your consent as a commitment that patients aren't participating in that, exclusively control that, but it's something to be aware of.
I think Olivia has a question about what is the best time to get feedback from potential participants on educational materials. As a sponsor, we want to get it right on the first try without having to submit an IRB amendment. I think there's been some cool discussion on this comment thread, but would just agree with Isabella's comment here. For instance, we have a patient advisory board that we bring in to do PPI. It comprises patient advocates, but we also mix in medics from our team who have clinical experience, as well as actual patients that we intend to enroll in the study, and do that early. And it's amazing how much of a difference having that perspective can make to the downstream, even pretty fundamental protocol design issues. Like, a slightly controversial take is that I think that a huge amount of the patient recruitment issues studies experience are because patients or doctors essentially weren't consulted early enough in the protocol design process. So yeah, big fan of that.
The earlier, the better. I think I saw some of the feedback using your patient advisory. You can have them look at scripts. You can have them just look at content as you're building that. I can understand, especially if there's anything that's produced, that might be hard. Like, I don't know if there's videos, but start it super early. You can do it while you're designing your trial. I wouldn't wait till that's finished. You can have them look at the content of what we're trying to do, or have them look at scripts, have them read scripts. But yeah, you can't start too soon. Because you could just build on it. Hey, we told you this last time. This is how we're thinking about it now. So we changed it to this. What do you think now? But I understand that if you're doing some kind of video and there's some financial output, that you're going to make something and then you have to tweak it, or that it goes to the IRB and they ask for changes. That can be expensive undertaking.
So all remains for me to say is a huge thank you to Paul and Julie, our expert panel, to you as the audience for your participation, for your questions. Thank you all so much. If you also want to check out the awesome work that Paul and Julie, their teams are doing, please do likewise get in touch with them. So thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to chatting with you all again soon.
All right.